Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another presentation here for the Green Mountain Bird Alliance. Tough time getting that out sometimes. It's taking a little adjustment. We're going to wait just a couple of more minutes and let the room populate, and we'll get going in just a few. Okay, so if you could just hang tight, we'll be ready to go. Well, I guess we'll get started. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to this evening's presentation sponsored by the Green Mountain Bird Alliance. We are thrilled to have you here, particularly on this warm evening, the first we've had in Vermont in a while. So we're grateful for you coming and joining us tonight. We want to thank many of you who are members of the Green Mountain Bird Alliance for your participation in our programs. Those of you who are members, your contributions go towards much of the work that we do in terms of sponsoring speakers and presentations such as tonight's, in sponsoring bird outings, conservation efforts, scholarships, and opportunities for students to participate in Audubon Vermont's camps during the summer. So thank you very much for that. If you're not a member, we really would like you to encourage you to join or encourage you to attend one of our outings that are listed, and just have to go to Green Mountain Bird Alliance and look at our events page. There's plenty there. So without further ado, we're grateful for our speaker coming this evening. I'm going to introduce a fellow board member, Liza Morse, and she's going to introduce our speaker for the evening. Thanks, Liza.
Hi, as Pat said, I'm Liza. I run the programs committee, and we're really excited to have Fen here to finish our 2025-2026 speaker season before we send you all off into the real world to go enjoy birds not on screens. So today we welcome Fen Levy-O'Malley, hailing from a small lobstering town in mid-coast Maine. Fen came to Audubon, Vermont in 2025 by way of Williams College, where they studied Massachusetts grassland birds and worked in the Hopkins Forest sugarbush. And then later Tufts University for their PhD in 2025. Many congratulations. In their graduate work, they followed shifts in forest structure, bird populations, and habitat use across 30 years of changing management in Northern Maine commercial forests, and explored territorial behavior in spruce budworm-associated warblers in Quebec. At Audubon, Vermont, they primarily conduct forest assessments, engage with producers, and survey breeding birds as part of the bird-friendly maple program. In their spare time, Fen can be found migrating to wintering sites at various Nordic ski trails, foraging for wild plants and fungi, or performing as a singer-songwriter and fledgling drag artist. I love all the bird puns in this bio. I cannot take credit for them. Well, Fen, we're very excited to have you speaking with us tonight, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Liza, and thanks, Pat, too. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and share some of the work that Liza was talking about. Can everyone see my screen okay? Awesome.
All good.
Great. So I'll be sharing today some of what I consider recipes for a bird-friendly forest. As any of you who are culinarily inclined might suspect, there's a whole bunch of different ways of making this particular recipe. But I'll be sharing some of the lessons that I learned during my grad school time between 2020 and 2025, working in the Maine Northwoods commercial forests. And the first thing I want to ask everyone to do is something essentially impossible, which is to put ourselves in the mind of a migrating bird. In this case, a little black-burnian warbler, one of my personal favorites. This is a very small denizen of mature mixed and coniferous forests in the Northeast. In Vermont, you're likely to find them in any mature hemlock gully, as well as throughout a lot of the mid-elevation spruce forest and mixed forest in the Green Mountains. And it's one of the longer distance migrants of our local breeding bird community. They spend the winter, as you can see here in the blue part of the range, in tropical forests of the Caribbean coast and the northern Andes, and then fly several thousand miles north to meet us here in New England. And in order to make the truly remarkable journeys that a lot of long distance migrant birds, like this Black-Burnian warbler, do, they have a range of tools at their disposal. Um, the first of these is, of course, genetics. A lot of the migratory pathways that birds follow are inherited from their parents since they might be making the trip alone. But there's a lot of other pieces that they help to navigate their way as they're following that map that they have in their head, essentially. A really fascinating one we're still learning more about is magnetic compounds that some birds produce within their brains that allow them to see the magnetic fields of the Earth and potentially use them like we would use a compass. Birds are also often very adept at navigating via the stars. Most small songbirds like this would be traveling at nighttime to avoid predation, and that also has the added benefit of providing a course in the sky to follow. As they get closer to the end of their migratory journeys, like this Black-Burnian warbler, they might be relying more on olfactory cues, things they can smell, like volatile organic compounds coming off of particular tree species that might be indicating a good place to land. And then as they really start to hone in on the final place that they want to end up, they might be paying attention to things like landscape context, habitat structure, where there might be big patches of forest or shrubland or whatever habitat type that they might be relying on, and using broad scale cues in order to find their way there. But the journey isn't over once they reach the breeding grounds, as some of our local birds are already starting to do in their return migrations. Once they get below the forest canopy, birds also have a whole host of other features of the forest that they need to be paying attention to. These might be good places to find food. A lot of these birds in the summer woods of New England rely on insects for food, and specific plant species can have species-specific relationships with different insects that they might be wanting to pay attention to. They also need a safe place to build a nest, and they might want some prominent song perches from which to display and attract mates or defend their territory. And they also will be making these decisions not alone, but in the context of a whole bunch of other individuals of their same species and other species around them who are all trying to kind of make their way during the breeding season at the same time. So if we as conservationists want to start putting together what we'd call recipes for bird habitat, it can be a really hard thing to do because there's so many different pieces of a bird's experience that we have to be keeping track of. We'll probably never know all of the requirements for an ideal habitat for a species, and we often don't have the time or resources to suss all of that out. So as conservation practitioners, often what we try and do is boil down those questions or all those components into these two of the questions like these. I usually choose these two. What are the key ingredients in making the recipe? And how do we, in approaching conservation at a landscape scale, make sure that there's a reliable availability of them over time? And this is really important in the recent context of what we know about bird conservation, which is from a study that came out in 2019 that some of you may be familiar with. We've lost 3 billion breeding birds from North America in the past 50 years since the 1970s. And what was most concerning about those declines is that they cut across species of different familial relationships, different habitat requirements, different dietary and foraging strategies. So there's likely a whole host of different factors that are contributing to bird declines at a continental scale. These are some of our main suspects in that decline. Habitat alteration cuts across birds of any habitat, but especially when we run into migratory species. They're also trying to navigate through increasingly urbanized areas along their migratory corridors. They might be contending with changing plant or seasonal phenology with climate change and running into introduced species as well. So the job of a contemporary ornithologist is to find out how to keep making recipes for birds' habitat under these changing and challenging conditions. So honing in a little bit on the study system where I was asking these questions, this is the green on the left here shows the Wabanaki Acadian Forest, which is eponymous with the contemporary Wabanaki Alliance of tribes for whom this is a traditional homeland. That includes the Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, and Micmac, among others. And today this landscape is roughly 4 million hectares or 10 million acres of primarily commercial timberland, this portion in Maine in green here. This includes a little bit of private land, some tribal holdings, a handful of Maine public lands and waterways, and a small amount of National Park Service land along the Appalachian Trail. So there's a whole patchwork quilt of different landowners and managers to contend with when we're thinking about managing forests at this scale. This area is also really important as a major biodiversity hotspot, as it's situated right in the transition zone between southern deciduous and boreal coniferous forest. So it's a real kind of mixing pot of those two different biomes. Part of the benefit of that mixing zone is that it's actually the largest contiguous important bird area in the entire lower 48 states of the U.S., particularly for the really valuable breeding season habitat that it provides through the northwestern Maine Northwoods and mountains and down into northern New Hampshire as well. It's also the largest undeveloped wilderness area east of the Mississippi in the lower 48. And is a core of the global breeding range for a number of species of high conservation need, like the Canada warbler, black-throated blue warbler, and Bicknell's thrush. So any impacts of commercial forestry that we're seeing in this primarily commercial timberland, whether those are positive or negative, could have a much wider impact on the birds of North America as a whole. So to understand the potential impacts that forestry might be having today, I think it's important first to dig into the longer term context of disturbance on this landscape. So the Northwoods of northern New England are relatively young in geologic time, having arisen roughly around the end of the last glacial maximum 15 to 20,000 years ago or so. But we estimate that the first First Nations peoples were arriving right around that time as the Northwoods were initiating their regeneration from the glaciers. And this means that indigenous stewardship has always been a component of the disturbance regime of this forest for as long as it's existed in its current form. Historically, that stewardship would combine with the impacts of annual winter ice load and wind throw, sporadic fire events, cyclical outbreaks of native insects like the spruce budworm, and even larger animals like passenger pigeons whose nesting colonies can cover or could cover hundreds of acres, in which the sheer weight of the thousands of passenger pigeon nests could topple trees and leave a sea of guano in their wake. So really, really massive, intensive local scale disturbances. Collectively, this variety of disturbances would have maintained a patchwork of regenerating forests within that broader quilt of old growth. But European colonization marks a number of major changes to this picture. First, through the combination of violence and disease, it was hugely destructive to the indigenous people of the region and their interactions with the forest. We also saw through this time the loss or reduction in some natural disturbance agents like passenger pigeon, beaver, which were essentially extirpated from the region, increases in fire suppression, and the historical disturbance regime was replaced by the new normal, which is the dominance of anthropogenic or human disturbance on the landscape. First through selective logging of white pine and spruce for British royal ship masts, and later the more comprehensive harvest of trees that gave rise to the commercial and industrial forestry of today. But within that last 100 years since commercial forestry kind of rose to prominence on the landscape, there's also been a lot of change in what commercial logging looks like. Broadly, it looks like more widespread and more frequent disturbance than would have occurred historically on the landscape. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight on a really significant recent transition in how forests were managed that was most important for informing my work. So prior to 1990, most of the landscape was owned and operated by what we call vertically integrated companies. Essentially, the paper mill on the outside of the forest owns the land, owns the timber on it, owns the roads, owns the contracts of everyone who works there, and essentially has their own private assembly line from forest to paper. Um, in the late 1970s and 1980s, the need for large wood volumes was compounded with a spruce budworm outbreak that was coming to spur on the heaviest clear cutting that Maine had likely ever seen, including this infamous Great Ragmuff clear cut in our survey area seen here in the 1990s in the aftermath there. Um, but by the 1990s, ownership of forest land in northern Maine started to make a major transition towards investment groups with very short-term management horizons and often little incentive to manage the forest after harvest. One of the accidental potential benefits of this change is that many clear cuts of the late 80s and 90s have since grown back into dense mid-age forest. This is an image of the former site of the Great Ragmuff clear cut as forest today. The other major change has come in the way that the forest is harvested. So, chiefly changing markets and some public pressure in Maine in the 1990s led to a dramatic decline in the use of clear cuts as a management strategy that you can see in the lightest blue line on the plot over here, and exchanged those for various partial cutting methods like selection cutting and shelter woods that you can see kind of rising up in prominence on the graph on the left. And those can look a variety of ways. They might look like what we call strip cutting, which creates those sort of parallel herringbone structures you can see in the aerial photo on the right. But it also might look like patch cutting, where you're cutting small portions of, clearing small portions of a forest stand without clearing the whole thing, that you can see kind of just right of center in that image. And the result of this shift on our focal area has been a halving of the total area of clear cuts on the landscape, and a huge increase that you can see in these purple bars close to the left here in young regenerating forest in various stages of its adolescence, so with some kind of structural messiness in the mix. But at the same time, we've also seen continued declines in mature forests, as we see in other areas of the region, like the Canadian Maritimes, over on the right hand of this graph here. So in my work, I was looking to better understand the relationship between these changes in forest practices and bird populations through these three main questions. First, I was looking at exactly that. How have forest practices shaped the populations of bird species over time? A question that arose out of that was how consistent birds are in selecting habitat across time periods, which can be useful in informing how we manage their habitat going forward. And then a final chapter that I dug into in my dissertation that we won't cover in much detail today was thinking about how those relationships between species influence their habitat decisions. Happy to answer questions about that afterwards. So in order to answer those first two questions, we used data from 387 sites that was collected back in the 1990s by the PIs on my project. And we complemented those with 420 new sites on the same landscape that we visited in 2021 and 2022. In order to establish where those sites were, we used a thing from timber companies called a stand map. It's essentially a paint by numbers kit of the different forest types that you have within an ownership. And so we stratified the survey points across 9 different categories of forest so that we could get a representative sample of each one. What a survey then looks like is something called a point count, which is essentially a 10-minute window within the breeding season of June into the local breeding bird community during the peak hours when they're making the most noise between 4 and 9 a.m. And then following the singing season in July and August, we would come back and do a detailed survey of the structure and composition of plants at each site to inform the different pieces, different features of habitat birds might be selecting for. From our bird surveys, we can then calculate a mean density or the birds per unit area of a species in each forest type. And then we can just multiply those by the total area of that forest to get an estimate of the overall abundance or the amount of that species at a full landscape scale. So when I was approaching our questions, we had kind of 3 main predictions. First, we expected that we would be seeing bird abundances declining kind of across the bird assemblage as we've seen at a larger scale in North America. We were expecting that birds would be making similar decisions in northern Maine as they do in other areas of the Northeast, like the Canadian Maritimes or elsewhere in New England. And we expected that most birds would have a consistent habitat recipe over time, consistent with a principle called niche conservatism, essentially saying species will make similar choices in the niche within a habitat that they focus on. Our first major finding, though, was the one that perhaps surprised us the most. And this was that instead of declining at a landscape scale, over half of the species on the landscape actually significantly increased in abundance since the 1990s, while another 25% didn't significantly change, essentially staying stable. And that included species from across the habitat spectrum and of different migratory, nesting, and foraging strategies. To give you a sense of what's going on in the graph here, any bar in gray is how many of those birds there were in the 1990s. The bars in light purple are how many there were in the 2020s. And then any kind of that dark blue color is where those two bars overlap, so you can see the difference over time. And the plot thickens even more when we consider these changes in the context of the larger region. In particular, if we focus on the top left quadrant here, every species in that purple box is one that increased or stayed stable in Maine since 1990, while declining within the broader Northeast region as a whole over the same time period based on breeding bird survey data. So if we had set out to predict the abundance changes in Maine based off of those breeding bird survey data, half of those predictions would have been wrong. In part, I think this reveals the value of filling in data gaps, in that the Northwoods is one of the less consistently covered areas in breeding bird survey data because it's so remote and hard to access. But I also think that it suggests that something unique might be occurring in Maine commercial forests that's promoting the persistence and success of species that are struggling elsewhere. So that was the next thing that I wanted to dig into. We can begin to tell that story by looking at mature forest-associated species, or those identified by other researchers as reliant on features of old forest for their survival and reproductive success. So if you were to plot one of those species out on a gradient from young to old forest going left to right, you might expect to see something like this, which is low or non-existent densities in those young forests, and then the birds really packing into older forests, being their preferred habitat. But on our focal landscape, none of the 12 expected bird species to be associated with mature forest followed quite that pattern, either in the 1990s or today. We're seeing kind of similar to the previous graph here. This is the density of each species per forest category on a kind of rough gradient from young to old forest, gray being 1990s, purple being 2020s. And kind of dark blue being the overlap between those two. Another way to put that is that we're seeing broader niche space among expected old forest specialists here in Maine than we're seeing elsewhere in the Northeast. But there's also been some change over time in those bird species relationships with forest. We can see some species occupying or abandoning particular forest types over time. And some species also showed more dramatic overall shifts in density across the habitat spectrum. Returning to our Blackburnian warbler here, we can see a shift from a more even distribution across mid-age forest in the gray of the 1990s to a distribution that was skewed a little bit more towards that old forest preference in the 2020s. And we'll get back to why that might have happened. Returning to our predictions, we essentially struck out on all three. So all of my expectations coming in were completely wrong. As a scientist, I consider one of the most exciting things that can happen, as it means there's a lot more about the system that you have yet to figure out. And in particular, I wanted to explore this last outcome here, a lack of consistent use in habitat over time. Specifically that they're being more kind of temporally flexible in their associations with forest types than we'd expected. To expand on that question, I measured habitat associations in these three kind of spatial dimensions. We have the fine scale associations with vegetation features within a stand where a survey was conducted. That's kind of those features we talked about at the beginning. And those are things that we can measure through our vegetation surveys. We might also see changes in how a bird associates with coarse forest types over time. That's that coarse scale. And then we can also look at the landscape context or the arrangement and amounts of different forest types around a bird's territory and whether that might be important. Each of those scales is going to contain features that differ in their specific value to a species. Some species might find specific nest sites at a fine scale, like tree cavities in a particular tree species, but they might also use a broader scale cues to select habitat, like large packages of contiguous old forest or particular forest types that they might need. For the rest of this talk, I'll focus mainly on the fine scale data, but we can discuss others after. So the first thing we do to analyze the fine scale data is generating something called a principal component analysis. You don't really need to know what that is. Essentially, to continue our recipe metaphor, this is like taking an inventory of our pantry. What ingredients are available on the landscape to make bird habitat and in what proportions? Essentially, the exact IDs of these vegetation variables aren't too important, but the basics are that the horizontal left to right axis here is separating forests in terms of their age, and the vertical axis is kind of doing that by composition and understory structure. And then what we can do from these data is plot out what we call niche maps for all 47 focal bird species. To read what's going on in each of these, the black outline of each shape essentially is showing all of the available conditions on the landscape based on our pantry inventory. The blue color is then where that species was in the 1990s, or what ingredients were necessary for that species habitat then. And then the red is the ingredients that were necessary in the 2020s. So the more overlap we see between those colors, the more consistent a species habitat recipe was over time. Couple of things jump out to me initially. The first is that the niche space occupied is very species specific. So each species appears to need its own very specific type of recipe. But there's also a wide range of the degree of overlap over time. These two species here represent kind of the extremes of that scale, where black-throated green warblers are associating with largely the same habitat ingredients over time. But then Canada warblers showed this huge change in the features that they were associating with only 5% overlap of the same features. And all the rest of the assemblage fits somewhere in this range in the middle, meaning that some degree of change in fine scale associations was pretty universal across the assemblage. We also dug into a number of kind of more complicated habitat models for each species based on different focus areas within those vegetation ingredients. And we saw a high degree of flexibility in those relationships as well. But most notably, flexible habitat associations occurred across increasing, decreasing, and stable species, with the only real signature of a relationship between abundance and habitat selection being that decreasing species showed a lower degree of overlap than we would have otherwise expected, which might in part reflect that they're just retreating from the landscape and so not in as many places as we would have found them previously. To dig into what that might mean a little bit more, I think it's one thing to notice, right, that species modeled relationships with habitat have changed, but it's another entirely to know whether that change is actually emblematic of something important for the species. Are they making new choices based on new things they need, or are we seeing them associate with different things as they follow a really important feature of their habitat through space and time? So for a simple example of what that looked like, we could say, let's say a species shifted in its fine scale associations from more connected to softwood trees than hardwood trees over time, but that their coarse associations with different types of forest didn't change over that same time period. If we'd gone into this study measuring only the vegetation variables in the forest, we'd be like, wow, look at this. The golden crown kinglets are associating with completely different habitat. Their habitat needs have changed. But if we'd only looked at the forest types and not the vegetation variables, we would have come to the opposite conclusion, that they had very conserved or inflexible habitat choices over time. So how do we know which one of these is correct? To quote my favorite science communicator, Zay Frank, science hippies would see this as a question about the fundamental niche of a species or the full set of habitat ingredients necessary for them to survive. Much as I would like to, we'll never be able to, hold a press conference with each individual species to ask them directly. So a common surrogate that we can use is to measure some aspect of a species' fitness or well-being, like its reproductive success, its survival, and relate that to habitat variables that you measure. But that's really hard to do at the time scale and spatial scale that we were looking. So the next best option is to identify strong associations like we did at different scales, and then use those as the basis for inference that you could then test with more detailed studies. And to kind of wrap us up here, I'll walk through a case study returning to our Blackburnian warbler with what that might kind of look like. So as a throwback to our graph, our plot from before, we can see that Blackburnian warbler declined significantly in both Maine and at a regional scale over the past 30 years since the 1990s. By roughly 50% in its abundance in northern Maine. So this is a species of concern for us, especially since it's also been declining in maritime Canada as well. And as we saw before, the species made this shift in density away from kind of an even distribution across mid-age and older forest into primarily older forest over that time period, specifically mature softwood forest or coniferous forest, spruce fir, on the right side of the graph here. Why this ended up making a huge difference for Blackburnian warbler abundance is that the distribution or the availability of forest types on the landscape made essentially the opposite change in the opposite direction. We gained a bunch of area of younger forest on the landscape while losing old forest at the same time. So Blackburnian warblers were essentially packing into a forest type that was rapidly disappearing on the landscape, and as a consequence, there were far fewer of them than there were in the 1990s. On the basis of this, I would have expected that Blackburnian warblers would not have been very conserved in their vegetation associations, but they were actually one of the most conserved in the vegetation variables that they were looking for at that kind of initial course scale. This was kind of confusing to me at first because it seemed contradictory to what we looked at before. But what it suggested is that Blackburnian warblers were likely tracking a fine scale set of variables or a particular variable that itself was shifting in how it was related to forest types over time. So the next place I looked was our tree canopy model, where we kind of broke down a species habitat requirements into the ingredients or amounts of ingredients by individual tree species. And what we found was that Blackburnian warblers the importance of red and black spruce became much more important in the 2020s for Blackburnian warblers than it had previously been, suggesting that this was a feature of the forest that they were actively looking for, or it was an indicator for something else that they were looking for that was also tied to spruce fir. But over the same time period, the mid-aged forest types that Blackburnian warblers had previously been found in significantly lost red and black spruce from their overall forest basal area or the amount of trees, while at the same time spruce remained relatively stable within mature forests. So it suggests that Blackburnian warblers, for whatever reason, had a strong association with red and black spruce trees that became much more important as those became a dwindling resource on the landscape. And as a consequence, they followed them into a habitat despite the fact that it was declining. This suggests that species might essentially make what we would perceive as bad decisions at a landscape scale because of features that they're focusing on. But a lot of them may not be able to see that landscape scale perspective. Most of their territories might be on the order of an acre or two. So the things they focus on may be at different scales than we're able to pay attention to or manage at a conservation perspective. So to loop that in to kind of what we can do in this landscape going forward, I wanted to leave you all with some pieces from my graduate work that I think could help us design better recipes for bird habitat with the ingredients at our disposal, both for now and for the future of the Maine Northwoods. First, I think on the basis of the wider and more flexible habitat selection that we were seeing in mature forest birds in Maine relative to those same birds in maritime Canada, I think this might be related to differences in forest management between Maine and the Maritimes, specifically in how forest is allowed to regenerate after harvest. So in the Canadian Maritimes, really intensive practices like plantation silviculture and herbiciding are kind of the norm. So a huge part of the province is very uniform single or double species monocultures, essentially, with very little understory and very little structural complexity. Those are far less common in northern Maine, and as a result, the young and mid-age forest in Maine tends to be denser, more species rich, has more tree diversity, and might be able to support a more structurally diverse understory over time in the areas where birds are trying to forage and find nesting space. So what I think this might mean is that currently younger forest in Maine might be providing features that a lot of old forest associated bird species like golden crowned kinglets, hermit thrushes might be able to take advantage of, whereas those species can't currently find them in Canada. That doesn't appear to be the case for the Blackburnian warbler, but for some of the other species that we looked at before, they might be able to get by in younger forest than we would expect because it has some of those older forest features. Similarly, the transition that we saw over time towards selective cutting and away from clear cutting opens the door for a lot more structural messiness and complexity at a fine scale. And this has been previously demonstrated to benefit a whole host of birds. And actually, from some research back in 2008, revealed this can also benefit insect communities that bird species might be feeding on, especially those little green inchworms that are kind of the bird manna during the breeding season. These researchers found that selective cutting resulted in an insect community that was more similar to uncut forest than clear cutting did. So it's possible that the statewide shift in forest practices could also be kind of raising the tide for all boats and providing more food across the northern Maine woods than might be provided elsewhere in the region. But we do know that some species are still linked with old forest and features that we know are dwindling in supply in other forest types. So the continuing decline of mature forest on the landscape is concerning despite the flexibility that some species might have. There's also a host of much less charismatic taxa than birds, like invertebrates, herbaceous plants, lichens, mosses, that have even stronger and less flexible relationships to old forest than birds do on the landscape. So if we're managing for mature forest bird habitat, we'll also see the co-benefits of managing on behalf of all of those other species that fewer people are paying attention to and fewer conservation dollars are going towards. So to sum up, if I had to boil it down to two recommendations that we can work with, one that would really help is longer harvest rotations, allowing more forest on the landscape annually to reach into those more mature stages and develop more structural complexity, more standing deadwood, more features those birds might be relying on, and especially identifying and finding ways to conserve intact blocks of residual old forest and old growth forest that still remain in the Northwoods as priority areas that are already providing those services at a landscape scale. This I'll sum up the work I have there, but first things first, there's a lot of acknowledgments to get through. I had a fantastic team of undergraduate and recent graduate field assistants who helped out during those two field summers. This type of work is impossible to do without them. If least for the logistical concerns that you can see of it being very difficult to navigate the Northwoods in a safe and reliable manner without people to have backing you up. But this also allowed us to cover the amount of ground and do the amount of work that we were able to. A whole host of organizations were involved in funding and providing feedback to the program. And I profuse thanks shared to my PI team who developed the original study in the 1990s and then were there to support the work in the 2020s as well. And would be remiss if I did not give an acknowledgement as well to the many myriad creatures of the Northwoods for their contributions to the work. And I'll wrap it up there. Happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Fen, so much. Yes, now is the time to put your questions in the chat. Since we have no questions in the chat right now, I will ask um, what is maybe a difficult and potentially controversial question, which
Go
is,
for it.
so you and I both love, and I'm sure many of our listeners love, northern woods and the breeding birds therein. I now am working in tropical forests, and I think about,
Mm,
both the fact that our North American birds are going down there in the winter, but also the fact that there's also a lot of endemic species, and that those areas of the world are like biodiversity hotspots compared to Vermont, Maine, the rest of New England. So despite the fact that we really love our woods and there are lots of species we want to protect, um, just thinking about how we balance like our
mm,
needs as humans who consume things, unfortunately, with the reality that when we don't cut in certain landscapes, we're often pushing those impacts into other potentially more biodiverse landscapes with
mm.
oftentimes fewer regulations around their logging industries. And so I totally hear you on rotation times, etc. But I'm wondering sort of like your experience in commercial forest landscapes, how do you see sort of that balance happening and how we address those
Mm.
concerns?
Fantastic points and question. I'll address one piece first and then get to the main question. First, I'm really glad that you highlighted the importance of thinking about the wintering ranges as well. Um, through the MODIS network and GPS trackers becoming more widely available to researchers, we're kind of at the precipice of learning a ton more about the vulnerabilities and threats that face migratory birds across their migratory and wintering journeys. That we, at least in kind of the North American Western science canon, have not been as connected to. Conserva Aves is doing a ton of really cool work down in South and Central America, building bird-friendly forestry practices on those landscapes. We also know that a lot of the species that I mentioned today are likely part of what's contributing to their abundance declines is habitat loss or degradation along the migratory and wintering pathways. So focusing on habitat for endemic species down there also has co-benefits on the species that we know and care about up in the north in their breeding range. But to address your main question, uh, it's a really sticky one to talk about in the commercial forest landscape. Um, Northern Maine is pretty unique in its ownership history and current ownership structure, especially in the context of the Northeast. There's a lot of private land in northern New England, but Maine, that big chunk of the unorganized territories, is one of the only places where a huge portion of the landscape is still operated by commercial timber management at a really large scale, like hundreds of thousands to millions of acres. Um, on the one hand, that kind of limits some of the ecological silviculture approaches that we might apply at a smaller scale, as I do in my current work at Audubon, working on the bird-friendly maple program. Um, and we might have to think a little bit more about the kind of landscape context scale of how can we identify particular forest blocks and make sure different types of forest are being provided for on the hopeful assumption that each of those forest types might contain important features. Um, I think you're spot on about the relative balances of human need in different landscapes. Kind of like we talked about earlier in the talk, the Northwoods is an incredibly resilient ecosystem and one that's evolved with a variety of different types of very destructive disturbance that could approximate what a clear cut does on the landscape. Um, so I think there's a lot of avenues for continuing to support the forest products industry and the benefits that we see from it in paper and wood and products that we, require for modern society to function, um, while also attending to the ecological balance and trying to mimic natural disturbance as much as feasible. Um, I think the most likely path forward in that regard is the current landowners on the landscape who have longer term management goals and so might have more flexibility to manage with longer harvest rotations or build in old forest features. One of which, in particular, I think about is Appalachian Mountain Club, who currently manage 100, pushing 200,000 acres of forest land around Moosehead Lake, with the explicit goal of using selective or a selection forestry to reintroduce old forest features onto the landscape faster than would occur by letting the forest grow naturally and try and return a core of old forest in the region that might not be provided for in the short term on the more intensive commercial portions of the landscape. That was a very long-winded answer, so let me know if I missed anything.
No, that was great. Thank you. Okay, so we have a question. Well, let's see. Two questions from Pat. Do you believe any of these recommendations might have value in maintaining specific habitats in the five great forests of Mesoamerica?
Ooh, I think it's possible. I'm not going to speak in too much detail about it because I don't consider myself very familiar with the ecology of those forests. Um, at a very coarse level, I know that a lot of tropical forests are a lot more disturbance sensitive than the temperate and boreal forests that grew back following glaciation. If not least from the fact that they haven't ever been glaciated, or at least, not since dinosaurs roamed the earth or sometime around there. So landscape scale disturbances of that type are less baked into the ecological function of those landscapes, and that can make them more vulnerable to habitat destruction through the type of intensity of harvest that you might be able to get away with in Northern Maine. I don't know if there'd be anything that you would add working more in that sphere, Liza.
Yeah, I'm not going to comment because I work in coffee, like agroforestry landscapes. So I don't have a lot to add, but I will just say yes, the ecology is very different because also tropical forests grow very quickly. So when you talk about rotation ages, I've had to totally blow up what I thought was normal for forests regrowing. The
Mm,
tropics regrow way more quickly, even if they don't grow back in the same way, in as predictable a way as perhaps a temperate forest. So yeah,
mm.
great question, Pat. Pat also asked, are Canadian foresters incentivized to change some of their timber harvesting methods?
Good question. Incentives are a big part of it. Unfortunately, there's currently a lot of, or at least unfortunately, in my opinion, there's currently a lot of Canadian subsidies that come from the Canadian government, especially on Crown land, for doing those intensive harvest practices because they're very productive. You produce a ton of wood really fast. Um, and so, from a pure kind of fiscal economic perspective, it makes sense through that calculus. There's a lot of folks within the Maritimes who are actively pushing for a more varied approach to forest management. Something called the triad approach has been advocated for a lot by a variety of conservationists and scientists in the Maritimes, which would look like doing intensive forestry some places, selection forestry, more ecological forestry others, and then leaving other places aside as reserves. There are some reserve areas within the Maritimes that are not cut frequently that can function as a similar core of old forest habitat. But the short-term prognosis looks a little more difficult for building in those features than what might be possible in northern Maine, where the regeneration is a little more chaotic and a little less managed.
Great. One question is very related to this. How long of a regrow period, or you would say rotation time, do you recommend at a minimum, and what's ideal? And maybe I will just add, can you put that in the context of like what's typical in Vermont versus Maine,
Mm,
or are there regional differences at all?
yes. Um, Vermont is a very interesting context in that we're the forest that we're starting with and that we find around us is coming from a different history of disturbance than occurred in Maine. some areas of southern Maine were heavily cleared, but most of northern Maine has never been cleared for agriculture in the same way that 85% of Vermont was completely deforested 150 years ago. So most of the forest that we run into in Vermont that's approaching older age is still at a relatively kind of even, not very strong, structurally complex canopy structure, where all of the trees are 100 to 150 years old. They might be relatively the same species if they all kind of grew up as a cohort together. And we haven't had quite enough time to build in some of those old forest features that arise from trees tipping over, creating gaps that young trees then come up in, trees aging, getting disease, dying, and forming snags or logs on the ground, the real kind of habitat value that we can see from an old forest. Whereas northern Maine has been much more areas of it have been more intensively managed over shorter harvest rotations, but never completely cleared all at once. So a lot of the forest in northern Maine is between 0 and probably 40 to 80 years old. Um, Also means that most of that forest doesn't contain some of those same old forest features. Um, but the prognosis for producing them can be different in both of those cases. Speaking from the Bird Friendly Maple program, one of the things that we often advocate for is intentional forest management to try and accelerate the process of sugar bush developing some of those features. So we look at producers selecting crop trees to try and build more species diversity into their forest over time, helping to kickstart regeneration and help it escape things like deer browse. Um, uh, by opening up gaps in the canopy to allow some light in to rejuvenate the understory, um, and then giving foresters options to help create snags or logs in stands that currently don't have a big supply of them. That type of thing would be very hard to do at scale in northern Maine. So I think the best option there for creating old forest for the short term is focusing on blocks where landowners currently have long-term ambitions in their forest management to help them manage for old forest at a large scale. Um, and one other thing I'll highlight is some researchers who were previous field techs of mine who've since gone on to develop their own projects based off of some of the work that I did here, have been doing some really fantastic work mapping and identifying all of the remaining pieces of original old growth forest in northern Maine and pieces that are rapidly approaching old growth stages. So they're hoping to and intending to use that to as a tool to give conservation organizations options for identifying currently unprotected old growth forest in the Northwoods as priorities for conservation or preservation going forward. Since a lot of that area is so infrequently visited that some of it we just didn't know about before they started doing that study.
Cool. So when you talk about those rotation times to develop those old growth features,
Right.
what is sort of the recommended? Obviously, there's a difference between what you, without getting too into the weeds of forest management talk,
Yeah.
there's a difference between what the stand age is versus the rotation time on cutting. But when you're
Yep.
going in to do those cuts to promote those features, what are we talking about here?
Probably 100+ years if you were doing a complete removal of the canopy, like a clear cut or a really heavy selection cut. Um, you might be able to, if you're using a lighter touch selection cut over a larger area, could harvest more frequently while still maintaining some older legacy trees on the landscape that could provide for the next generation. If you're in a situation where you have some old forests on a commercial ownership that's looking to be harvested. That would be an option to maintain some of those features more on the landscape. Depends on the landowner how currently
Totally.
open they are to those options. But there's a variety of landowner goals out there. So
And
there's
then
places where it can happen.
if you're a landowner in Vermont with kind of relatively young forest, how does that compare? Of like
If
what
if
rotation?
you currently have relatively young forest, it's probably going to take a similar amount of time to the current mature forest we have on the landscape of 100 years or more to develop those features if it's currently at a young state. However, that's not a reason to feel bad, as younger forest also has value to a lot of the bird species on this landscape. The chestnut-sided warbler right at left center in the images on the screen here is a species that loves forest between 5 and 15 years old, those really dense thickets of young scrubland and young deciduous trees. So thinking about your land in the context of the landscape around you can also be really valuable. You might be the only patch of young forest within a broader mature forest matrix, so that might be a beacon for woodcock and chestnut-sided warblers, redstarts as it gets older, ruffed grouse, a whole host of other species. So every forest at every age has value, and I think if I were to boil it down to kind of one thesis, the most important thing is making sure that we maintain each of those forest types in enough of a supply that the bird and wildlife communities that rely on them can continue to find them on the landscape.
Great. Two more questions and then we will end. So you got at this throughout your talk, but maybe you can boil it down into a succinct takeaway. Does a decline in one region in birds necessarily equal a decline in population overall? How can we tell if populations are just shifting? And is shifting always a bad thing?
Shifting's not always a bad thing. We anticipate that a lot of bird species are going to shift as climate change moves their ideal ranges northwards. So a lot of conservationists are already anticipating a lot of that happening kind of beyond our control, other than providing for a mix of habitats that they can move through as they do. I'm not being one of the authors on the Cornell paper from 2019 on the 3 billion bird decline, I can't speak in too much detail about their methods or on their behalf. But I know that the data they were relying on was pretty much continent wide. So they had a high degree of confidence that the declines they were seeing were representative of the populations of those species as a whole. I think what our research revealed, if anything, is that a species can be declining while still doing well in some places, but doing really poorly in other regions. And I think if there's a takeaway to take from that, a hopeful one from a conservation perspective, it's to identify places where birds are still doing well if they're declining, and try and learn as much as we can about what's going well in those regions so we can replicate it elsewhere and help maintain a matrix of habitat across the continent that they can move through.
Great. That would have been a great note to end on, except I have one more question for you.
All good.
Are there any commonalities in either the diet or the habitat of the 8 species you noted as in decline that set them apart from your other species?
Great question. Not particularly when it comes to diet. It was I'm not going to remember all of them off of the top of my head. Some of them that folks would be familiar with, boreal chickadee, bay-breasted warbler, and Lincoln sparrow and winter wren are the ones I can remember in addition to Blackburnian warbler. Those cut across the spectrum of forest ages. If there is a through line, most of them are associated with softwoods and boreal forest. So I suspect for a component of the decline that we saw in the landscape might simply be related to the ongoing effects of climate change and the expected range shifts that we see in those species out of the region over the next 100 years as they pursue that habitat retreating further north. But at a species by species scale, there's some complexity in there as well. We know that winter wrens and Blackburnian warblers also breed much further south than Northern Maine. So specific habitat features like the ones we identified for Blackburnian might also be lacking in those other species in ways that we could address in the meantime, and help buffer that transition northward as it happens over the next 100 years.
Great. Well, hey, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I could nerd out with you about this for hours, and I'm sure others on the call could too, but we're going to let everyone go enjoy their first real spring evening in Vermont. And with that, I will say thank you to Fen and thank you all so much for attending. Please check out our website. Right now, we're still, I believe our URL is still our Green Mountain Audubon URL, but we will be transitioning at some point over to Green Mountain Bird Alliance. But check that out for our in-person walks. Pat will be there, I think, for most, if not all, of our walks, along with our other board members. So come see us in person and look at some birds. And with that, I will wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thanks so much for coming, everyone.